Hi, wanted to record a video here, something I was thinking about for a while. In 2013, and if you look at my other videos, I talk about this. I don't know if anybody ever does that, goes back and looks through the other things that I posted. I don't know if you do that on Twitter or not. I noticed I'm getting quite a few people looking, probably the most, and I know the most ever, that I posted about Tom Hanks being a pedophile, and he abused a woman named Sarah Ruth Ashcraft, and Tom, I sent him a message on his Twitter account, I don't know, about a week ago, and he got the message, and then he went into a Barnes & Noble bookstore, and if you look at his most recent post, he shows himself getting his book off of the bottom shelf of the Barnes & Noble bookstore and putting it up on the top shelf. Well, he starts off showing some other books, anyways, long story short, the inside of his book, he was giving me a message. The photographs in his book were taken by a man named Kevin Toomey, and Tom Hanks I think he wrapped up filming the Mr. Rogers show in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there was a man named Tom that he was worked on the project with. The man's a writer for ESPN, so two Toms. And the interesting thing about Kevin Toomey, he has an office on, I think it's Pennsylvania Avenue in San Francisco. There was a shooting, or there wasn't a shooting. It was reported that there was a shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood where Mr. Fred Rogers used to live, the real man, the guy that had the PBS television show, the children's show, and I think it was on TV for like 40 years. Fred Rogers lived in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, and it was reported in the news media, on the mainstream news media, the one that reaches millions of people, like CBS, like Sumner Redstone owns CBS. And I've contacted Sumner's office and told them no one was killed. Sumner's Jewish, and his daughter Sherry was married to a rabbi. They won't report it. They won't tell CBS to report that no one was killed. President Trump is being blackmailed. I don't know why, but no one was killed. And I got this information from Robert David Steele. Robert David Steele owns the Earth Intelligence Network. I've been following his information for a while. I read a book that Robert wrote called Open Source Everything, and I was so moved by that book. After I finished it, I donated $100 to him, and Robert replied back to me. He said he had tears in his eyes. He was wondering where he was going to get money to buy gasoline and printer ink. So he runs on a very small budget, but he has some of the best information. And he doesn't like me bothering him when I email him stuff because he already knows what I email him. He already knows about it. So, but Robert David Steele has really good information, and that's where I got the information from, that there was no shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on October 27th. But Robert David Steele made one good point. He says there were no body bags. Nobody brought any bodies out of the building. So it's a huge cover-up. And it's interesting, Tom Hanks was filming this Mr. Rogers show in Pittsburgh, and he has this book written called Uncommon Type, and he's a pedophile, and he has this photographer who photographed pictures for his book named Kevin Toomey, and there were two Toms that were involved in the movie about Mr. Rogers. And this Kevin Toomey, the photographer, has an address on Pennsylvania Avenue in San Francisco, California. And then you got like Hanks, which sounds like Shanks, and Shanksville is where the United States government says Flight 93 crashed, but it did not. It landed in Cleveland. And then I have this woman, Sarah Ashcraft, who was abused by Tom Hanks because he's a pedophile. Her name sounds like aircraft to me. And so I wanted to mention, just to change the subject if I could real quick, I was put in jail in Portland, Oregon in 2013. I've talked about this in my other videos. I say the same things over and over again. In April of 2013, I think it was April 10th, the Portland, Oregon police came out to my residence, and I was on the phone with Rabbi Praver of Newtown, Connecticut, and he was telling me that he attended a funeral and for Noah Posner, and he saw a body. And I tried to explain to him, well, no one was killed because the school was closed since 2008. So I don't understand how you could have gone to a funeral. And he kept telling me, no, he went to a funeral, he saw a body. How could the man not know that the school was closed since 2008? The shooting was said to have occurred on December 14th, 2012. December 14th is James Comey's birthday. That's the former director of the FBI. Well, anyways, it was an FBI special agent in charge, Kimberly Shea. She was using the name Kimberly Mertz at the time. And she requested, or had someone working for her, that we requested that the FBI contact the Portland police, and this is in my FBI file, which I got in 2015. Request the FBI, or request the Portland police to come out and arrest me, claiming that I was mentally ill. And I had been getting harassed and stalked by the Portland police prior to them arresting me. I talked about it in a previous video, there was one day when I went out to get a cup of coffee. I walked down the street, I had to cross a busy street to get to the other side to where there's a Fred Meyer's store, and there's a Starbucks inside there. And there's a big parking lot, and there were 5 police cars in a staging area in this parking lot. And I looked over, and one of the police officers kind of turned away, like he was embarrassed or ashamed of something. And I just kept walking, and went and got my coffee. And then I got a phone call, but I let it go to voicemail because I didn't want to take the call at that moment. And then about 10 minutes later, I retrieved the voicemail, and it said, they said, Kevin, this is the Portland police. We're out in front of your house. We want you to come out. We want to talk to you. It was those 5 police cars that I had walked past several, like maybe 15 minutes earlier. It was them. They had driven down the street and parked out in front of the house, and then called me. And I was across the street having a cup of coffee at Starbucks. And then there was another time where I had some guy follow me into a Jamba Juice, because that Jamba Juice is kind of like a, I don't know if you guys heard of it. There's like another place that's similar called, I think it's called Famous Amos, Jamba Juice. They serve these juices. And so I used to go over there and talk to the women sometimes, and then I would buy a Jamba Juice too. And this guy, I knew he was a cop, but he was plain clothes, and he was, I don't know, trying to feel me out and talk to me, and I could tell, you know, and so I left. But back to Kimberly Mertz, or Kimberly Shea. I ended up getting arrested by the detective, Tony Harris. I was on the phone with Rabbi Praver. I got a knock at the door. hung up the phone with Praver, answered the door, 3 detectives, 2 male, 1 female. One male says he's Detective Tony Harris, says he's in charge. And then there's another fat detective who I don't remember his name. Then it was the female, her name is Pam, and she was standing over by the fence. Detective Harris told me they had jumped over the fence when I asked them how they got in. I asked them if they had a search warrant. I wasn't sure why they were there. And the fat man said that if they had to get a search warrant, they were going to break all the windows in my house and drag me off to jail. They said they wanted to know who I'd been calling in Newtown, Connecticut. Nobody was killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. The school had been closed since 2008. All of those people are lying. So, but I told the police, look, don't break the windows. I'll meet you tomorrow at Starbucks. Now, in my FBI file, it says that the FBI told the Portland police to arrest me because they claimed that I was mentally ill because I was calling the people in Newtown. And the people in Newtown were calling the Newtown police or going into the police office and reporting me, and then the Newtown police were contacting the New Haven FBI office. So the New Haven FBI told the Portland police that I was mentally ill. Portland police have a long history of being very abusive, physically abusive, with people that are mentally ill. The Department of Justice have spoken to them about this. So I'm not mentally ill. I've never been mentally ill. But the FBI told Portland that I was mentally ill. They threatened to break all the windows in the house. Then, with the understanding in their minds that I have a mental illness, they allowed me to convince them to meet them the next day at a Starbucks, over 24 hours later. And they agreed to it. The agreement was to meet at 9:30 a.m., and I told them I wanted to sit outside. Well, the next day I went over to Starbucks. I got there at 9:20. I sat down on the bench outside, and I sat there till 9:50, and nobody showed up. So I left. I didn't want to go into the Starbucks because I don't like the crowd of people there in that particular Starbucks. I like Starbucks, but I just don't like that crowd. And the next day I was arrested coming out of that Fred Meyer store that I mentioned earlier, because they're in the same parking lot. It's over on near the Gateway Transit Station. There's a train system out here called the MAX, and there's a train station called Gateway Transit Station where you can transfer from one train to another, and then across the street is the Fred Meyer's shopping center. So I was walking out of that Fred Meyer's store with my coffee when this, I think it was like a white Toyota car with Detective Tony Harris behind the wheel, comes driving up, stops. The fat guy and the woman, Pam, jump out and run towards me. And I'm standing there, I'm holding my coffee in my left hand. And they ran up and they grabbed me by the wrist. And I remember I didn't want to let go of my coffee. And that fat guy took it out of my hand and put it on the ground. And then after I was handcuffed, this Detective Tony Harris comes and he stands like off to my right. And there was this horrible smell, and I told him, "You stink." And he just looked at me. I hate that man so much. I don't know why the Portland police allow him to work there. I was arrested. They called the patrol car. I was put in the patrol car. I think the driver, his name was John, I believe. And I was complaining to him on the ride over, telling him what an idiot I thought he was for taking these orders. And I was taken up to the 13th floor where the detectives work. I talked about this in a previous video. And I ended up spending 2 months in jail. My bail was increased from $10,000 to, I skip something there. I had an arraignment the next day. When I got there and I was booked and I was put into my cell late at night, the deputies told me that the sheriff deputies who work in the jail, they told me, "Oh, you'll be out the next day." And then I went to arraignment, and the arraignment, the judge increased my bail from $10,000 to $100,000, and I'm certain it was because Detective Harris said that I wasn't cooperating with police. I had told Detective Harris that Flight 93 landed in Cleveland, Ohio, that the passengers were interviewed in the NASA Glenn Research aircraft hangar by FBI agents. Now, it was the FBI that had requested, the New Haven FBI, that had requested my arrest, but it was the FBI in Ohio, I guess Cleveland, I don't know if Cleveland has a division there, but it was FBI agents from Ohio went out to the airport, Cleveland Hopkins Airport, and NASA Glenn Research has an aircraft hangar there, and that's where the passengers went into, and they were interviewed by the agents. So there was no plane crash in Shanksville. And Robert Mueller was the director of FBI at that time. I think he became director on September 4th. And then there was the September 11th attacks a couple of days later. Robert Mueller has never spoken publicly about this. One of the things I think is really hypocritical, and it's infuriating, is there was a young woman named Reality Winner who was sentenced to 63 months in prison because she provided information to the news media that Russians were getting involved in the 2016 election. And she's in Carswell, FMC Carswell in Texas. It's a prison, a women's prison located on an Air Force base. I've heard horrible stories about that place. The women are treated really badly there. The people are treated really badly in prisons everywhere in the United States. But Robert Mueller has known that the passengers of Flight 93 landed in Cleveland for 17 years. He hasn't spoken about it. He hasn't spent any time in prison. And he was involved with, investigating President Trump for the Russian involvement in the 2016 election. How hypocritical is that? Reality Winner should be pardoned and released immediately. Robert Mueller should be put in prison. I have a complaint filed with the Office of Professional Responsibility, but I don't know what they're doing. I ended up taking a guilty plea to get out of jail. I was abused when I was in jail. There was a deputy, Rodney Schaefer, a Lieutenant Penna, and a third deputy who I could pick out visually if they had a police lineup, but I don't remember his name. And they've never been held accountable for that abuse. I have complained to the Multnomah County Sheriff's Department, but they replied back that, maybe next time when I deal with the Sheriff's Office, I'll have a better experience. They're assholes. I have made a number of complaints to County Chair Deborah Kafori. Now, Deborah Kafori's husband, Nick Blosser, is the Chief of Staff for Governor Kate Brown. Deborah is a horrible woman. I was dumb enough to spend 5 years contacting her office, asking for help. I wanted to complain about the Sheriff's Department, and because her office, the county chair, oversees the Sheriff's Department, and the sheriff now is a man named Mike Reese. But back then, when I was Mike Reese, who's now the county sheriff, was actually the chief of police back when I was arrested. And my story was all over the news. It was in the newspaper and it was on television. So I'm sure Mike Reese saw it. I know that I had a federal public defender who told me she remembers seeing me on television. And I talked about my federal case in another video. And, I had a case with federal judge Michael Mossman, chief judge, and he's a FISA court judge in Washington D.C. They have a special court in the E. Barrett Prettyman courthouse. And the interesting thing about that is I believe the chief judge of the FISA court I think his last name is Hogan. And Michael Mossman's wife's maiden name, Chief Judge Michael Mossman's wife's maiden name is Hogan. I think it's Susan Hogan. I think that's right. I thought that was kind of weird. John Roberts would be the one that appointed Michael Mossman to the court. I know the way he became a judge, he was recommended, if I remember this right, by Senator Ron Wyden. Senator Ron Wyden, who I've never heard back from, he picked Michael Mossman and recommended him to President George W. Bush. And then I guess the president goes and says this is who he wants for a federal judge, and then he has to get approved by the Senate. I've never heard anything from Senator Wyden's office at all. And he was the one that recommended Michael Mossman to President George W. Bush. And George W. Bush, was the president on 9/11. And I was told by John Lear, who is a retired commercial airline pilot. He has over 19,000 hours of flight time. He has a website called The Living Moon, where he talks about how he's not the only one that does this. There's a lot of stuff up on the moon. There's buildings on the moon, there's roadways, bridges. The moon has an atmosphere that goes up to about 15,000 feet. You can walk around on the moon without wearing a spacesuit. John has a lot of good information. Well, John says that on 9/11, the United States Navy used 15 directed energy weapon satellites to destroy the World Trade Center in New York City. Now, I had heard something similar to this. I didn't know it was 15 directed energy weapon satellites owned by the Navy, United States Navy. I had read a book by Dr. Judy Wood where she talks about the directed energy weapon. She wrote a book titled, I have it here, Where Did the Towers Go? This is Dr. Judy Wood's book. And I have had her book for a while. It's an excellent book. It's a beautiful book, actually. She put a lot of care into creating that book. It's really beautiful if you ever want to buy it. Inside, it's really well put together. I mean, there's all kinds of diagrams and pictures, and she put a lot of work into that book. I had mentioned in previous videos about another book I had read, or two books, but I'm not going to mention, well, I'll mention it. Solving 9/11 by Christopher Bolin. He talks about there being explosives, nanothermite. So I think it was a combination of nanothermite and the directed energy weapons. I had mentioned this to Alfred Lambermont Weber on Facebook, because I had mentioned it. Andy Bashago is going to run for president, and he wins. Andy was involved in Project Pegasus, which was a time travel teleportation project that was put together by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I don't give Alfred nearly enough. I haven't told him. It was Alfred is the reason that I found Andrew Bashago like 8 years ago. I was renting a room in Sacramento California. I was up late one night, 3 o'clock in the morning. I had just purchased a HP laptop computer from Walmart, and I was up late, and I found this article about teleportation that was written by Alfred Lambermont Weber. And it was the first time, I'd ever seen this guy's name, and I was reading it, and it talked about Andrew teleporting. He wrote about Andrew Basiago teleporting, and I thought it sounded really interesting, but I couldn't visualize, someone traveling from one place to another without being, visible in between the 2 points. Because Andy was going from New Jersey to New Mexico with his father, Raymond F. Basiago, who worked for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which is headquartered in Pasadena, California. They were going cross country in like 2 seconds through a Nikola Tesla teleport. And the reason I came up to Portland, Oregon in 2012, and then I got stuck here, is I wanted to meet Andrew. He lived in Vancouver, Washington, which is just a few miles away from Portland, Oregon. I had come up from New Mexico. I had gone to New Mexico. I started off in Sacramento, California, and I rented a room for 8 months. That's when I read about Andrew from Alfred, and then I did more reading about that subject. I also had spoken with a man named Philip Corso Jr. Philip built the Roswell craft that was recovered in 1947. It was crashed on July 4th, Independence Day. And Philip had sent it from the year 2034. He talks about this in an interview with a man named Kevin Moore. So I went to go see Philip in 2011. I left Sacramento and flew out from Sacramento. We stopped off in Colorado, in Denver. I went on Southwest Airlines and then landed in Fort Lauderdale. I spent, I think, 2 days in Fort Lauderdale and then went up to Fort Pierce, which is next to Port St. Lucie. And Phil Corso had a business called High Speed Composites, where he worked with his 3 sons, Philip, Nicholas, and Andrew, building experimental aircraft. And I had called a customer of his named Felix Denman, who owns a company called Southern Sewer in Fort Pierce, and then he has another location in Orlando. And Felix had purchased an airplane, or had Philip put together an airplane for him, a kit airplane. And the reason I found Felix was Phil Corso Jr. had a video online, I think it's still up, where he talks about his father's book, The Day After Roswell. I have it here, but it's buried under a bunch of other books. And he has some planes in the hangar where he works, and I was able to stop the video and look at the tail number and look the tail number up to find who owned the plane. And I'd never done anything like that before, but I found out Felix Denman on the plane, and then I called him up on the phone, found where he worked, looked his business up, and called him. And he said, if you're in town, come by, we'll get some coffee. So I went out to Florida and was in Fort Lauderdale. I remember calling Philip Corso Jr. on the phone, and I had spoken with him when I lived in Sacramento. I called 4 times. Each of the first 3 times he told me he had epoxy all over his hands. He was working on the planes. He couldn't talk. And then the 4th time he spent time with me on the phone, he told me there's a moon base called Project Horizon, and his father worked on that. Philip says he was about 13 years old, I think, and he remembers seeing plans for Project Horizon in his father's office. And then he told me